Thank you very much for those inspiring words, Justice Breyer, Ambassador André Haspels, and Deputy Mayor Saskia Bruins. Brookings is very grateful to all of you for your support and to the Klingendahl Institute in The Hague for partnering with us. So we're meeting here for the 7th Breyer Lecture on International Law, and Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer, for whom this lecture series is named, himself gave the first lecture in 2014. And this past year, our own struggles with democracy and its adversaries have reminded us that the great debates about the future of international law and a rules-based order and law are intimately connected to the legitimacy of our own constitutional orders. And we wanted our lecturer this year to remind us that democracy is not just about abstract principles of constitutional law like representation, rule of law, and protection of civil rights, but a real aspiration for real people in a real fight. So it is my immense honor to introduce as our speaker, Ms. Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya. We're all struggling with this, but then I have a difficult last name myself. She is the head of the democratic opposition in Belarus. After a rigged national election in August 2020, she has become the leader of the greatest protest movement seen in Belarus since the country's independence in 1991, peacefully mobilizing up to 200,000 people on Sundays. President Lukashenko has responded with increasingly brutal repression. And Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya's husband was made a political prisoner, like 200 other Belarusians at least. She had to take her children to exile in Lithuania, from where she continues to argue the cause of democracy and freedom. The European Parliament awarded her its prestigious Sakharov Prize last December. Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for joining us for the 7th Breyer Lecture.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for this kind introduction. But before I attend to my remarks, I would like to wish happy Passover to Jewish people around the world. This is a true inspiration for those seeking freedom. So I'm honored to deliver the 7th Annual Justice Stephen Breyer Lecture on International Law, and I'm truly grateful to speak in front of such distinguished audience. So I'm not a lawyer or legal expert, not a trained politician. I'm just a proud citizen of my country who has learned the value of democratic principles, rule of law, and justice through my own life experiences. I'm here first and foremost as a Belarusian who wants positive change for my country and its people. Last year's electoral campaign marked the beginning of my personal journey. And I'm humbled that my story has inspired so many people in Belarus and around the world, including here in the United States. A question asked repeatedly by this audience in the past few years: is democracy in decline? According to a recent Freedom House report, in every region of the world, democracy is under attack by populist leaders and groups that reject pluralism and demand unchecked power to advance in particular interests of their supporters, usually at the expense of minorities and other perceived force. The year 2020 was recognized as the 15th consecutive year of decline in global freedom. The situation poses global changes to all forces that value democracy. Therefore, the experience of a nation which is willing and ready to fight for freedom and justice has a special significance. Belarusians who have clearly expressed their desire for freedom represent a powerful ongoing case. It can explain, if not all, many problems and challenges facing democratic societies around the world. But before turning the international context, I would like to explain why I am deeply concerned that Belarus has turned into a country of lawlessness. In the country of lawlessness, we are dealing with a human rights crisis of unprecedented proportions, worsening by the day. One of the key elements of this crisis is a total collapse of the rule of law, or as we call it in Belarus, a legal default. As of today, over 33,000 have been detained. More than 1,000 cases of torture documented. and we have close to 300 political prisoners and counting. More than 2,500 criminal cases have been initiated against journalists, human rights defenders, activists, and peaceful protesters. At least 8 protesters were killed. Just yesterday, when Belarusians celebrated Freedom Day, more than 240 people were detained all over the country. We are faced with the repressions Belarusians haven't known since the Stalinist times. Meanwhile, not a single government official has been held accountable for the brutality, repression, torture, and murder. In the country of lawlessness, civil society activists, human rights defenders, and independent journalists have faced unparalleled harassment and ill treatment. Police raided the offices of Vesna Human Rights Center, the Belarusian Association of Journalists, and Belarus Solidarity Foundation, with many detained. Homes of activists and their relatives have also been searched and raided. In the country of lawlessness, defense attorneys are under pressure. They are often the only connection between political prisoners and their families. And instead of defending its members, Belarusian Bar Association has been intimidating such attorneys. And this lack of access to independent defense counsel severely limits the rights of Belarusians to a fair trial. The government has launched the process of recalling several attorneys' licenses. Alexander Pylchenko, who represented presidential candidate Viktor Babarika. Lyudmila Kazak, who represented Maria Kolesnikova. Sergei Zikratsky, who has been defending several journalists. Maxim Znak, who was my legal counsel and who is now facing 20 years in prison on trumped-up charges. And even my husband's lawyer, Olga Baranchik, won't be able to represent him in a month's time. And my husband is facing 15 years in prison. So democracy, the rule of law, justice, one deficient or absent, can become the core of the conflict between the state and the people. If there was even an aspiration for democracy in Belarus, the elections would have been free and fair. Instead, when the people cast their votes, they were blatantly disregarded. And this happened before in Belarus, but this time Belarusians clearly witnessed how their rights to choose leaders had been violated. Since August 2020, our people have peacefully expressed their disagreement, demanding a new democratic Belarus where they participate in governance, and their rights and freedoms are respected. And they pursue this goal with unity and persistence. The unity of the entire society in its aspiration for change is evident. Led by women, our protest movement is inclusive and diverse. The strength and vulnerability of Belarusian women defy the regime's violent rhetoric and methods. Workers, athletes, teachers, doctors, scientists, students have all come together. The persistence of Belarusians is demonstrated by the acts of everyday heroism, displaying the national white, red, white flag, decorating backyards with ribbons, standing in a solidarity chains, jointly paying fines of those arrested, attending court hearings to support the people they have never met before. Our senior citizens lead younger generations by example. One of them is Nina Baginskaya, a real symbol of endurance. People with disabilities demonstrate that their abilities are limitless in fighting for the entire country and human dignity. Belarusians have been protesting despite the possibility of injury, loss of employment, expulsion from the country, and even murder. If there was the rule of law in Belarus, the government would have been constrained in how it responds to people protests, and the freedom of assembly would have been respected. Instead, Lukashenko and his subordinates unleashed unprecedented violence on their own people. Alexander Raikovsky was the first victim of police brutality. He was standing with his bare hands and was shot point blank by a police squad in Minsk. Hinat Shutov was shot by military officers with no insignia impressed. In all its absurdity, last month he was posthumously found guilty of disobeying a police order, while his killers remain unpunished. If there was justice in Belarus, political prisoners, people who were beaten and tortured, would have been released in the courtroom, while real perpetrators held accountable. Instead, day after day, we learn about new sentences that are handed down to the people who did nothing wrong. We are back to 1937, when the verdicts were known before the trial, and the right to a fair trial was non-existent. A former special operations military officer and an artist, Roman Bondarenko, was murdered by the regime cronies in his own backyard for protecting our national symbols. And this case shook Belarus and the world. As part of their cover-up, the regime tried to silence the doctor Artem Sorokin. Despite the pressure, he declined to falsify the autopsy and disclose the true cause of Roman's death. And he received a 2-year prison sentence for upholding his oath. 2 female journalists, Daria Chultsova and Katerina Andreeva, were convicted of organizing actions grossly violating public order and were sentenced to 2 years in prison. Their crime was in live streaming a vigil for Roman. And all the while, I'm very proud that despite all the state terror, violence, and cruelty by authorities and general lawlessness, our protest has remained peaceful. Our demands have been consistent and firm: an immediate end to violence and repressions, the release of all political prisoners, and free, fair, and internationally observed elections by fall 2021. Now I would like to speak about the international response to the crisis in Belarus. The international community has taken a principled stance on the 2020 election in Belarus, refusing to recognize its officially declared results as legitimate. The US called the elections fraudulent. The EU concluded that the election campaign was neither free nor fair and didn't recognize Lukashenko as legitimate leader. The cooperation between a new democratic Belarus and its international partners will be based on universal values of democracy, rule of law, respect for human dignity, and equality. However, these values have been under pressure worldwide, including the West. The challenges to democracy and human rights in Belarus are not new. They are deeply entrenched in the fabric of political system. And this system has mastered the art of manipulating public opinion and election rigging. This system severely limits the freedom of speech and association. Opposition candidates are eliminated, imprisoned, or are forced into exile. The parliament is a sleepy rubber stamp institution composed of hand-picked regime supported, while all the branches of the power are subordinate to one person. The ambition of this one person and his small group of collaborators to remain in power shouldn't deprive the entire nation of developing constructive relations with its neighbors and strategic partners. Lukashenko's foreign policy has never served our national interests. The new foreign policy of Belarus will pay close attention to relations with our neighbors, which include not only East and West, but also North and South. This is where an untapped potential for our economic development is hidden in plain view. And it is crucial that the international community stays true to its own principles, priorities, and policies. Consistency is a key in any complex international undertaking. And Belarus has a history of an early positive international response to promises and assurance of actors without credibility. And it is very important for those fighting for democracy to feel the continuity of attention and support from the international democratic community. In the past, after the outpouring of attention, the status quo would set in. Or as in Belarus example around 2014, West made its democratic strive secondary when it decided to make a deal with the proven devil and improve relations with Lukashenko. At that time, Belarusian civil society received very little support and was doomed to survival mode. Especially this is the reason civil society infrastructure wasn't prepared for the events of 2020. And while all countries and systems face their own challenges, we need to reassert that the crisis in Belarus is a matter not only of Belarusians. It is in the interest of all international communities to have it resolved through peaceful means and negotiations, and to avoid further escalation. And a precondition to this engagement is to make sure that the international community remains focused on resolving this crisis. Actions must be swift, practical, and efficient. For example, it took months for concrete actions from the international community in response to the regime crackdown of protests. But flexibility and prompt action-oriented response are very important to sustain the protest momentum, as we had it in the fall of 2020. It also demonstrates to dictators that their actions will have practical consequences. And often not just the severity of the sanctions, but the inevitability and speed can be impactful in containing the authoritarian power. Over the past 7 months, I have met with a great number of decision makers who have been very supportive of the Belarusian cause. I cannot but emphasize that the efforts of the international community, including political, financial, and economic pressure, are directly connected to the progress in setting up negotiations on the peaceful transition of power in Belarus. In these efforts, we ask you to speak with one voice as a global coalition of friends of Belarusian people. And last week, I announced a national vote. And within a week, 750,000 people voted online to support such negotiations through international mediation under the auspice of the UN or OSCE. And we would welcome a constructive role of all nations, including Russian Federation, on the basis of respect for the sovereignty and independence in Belarus. Based on the OSCE Moscow Mechanism report on March 24, Denmark, Germany, and UK established an international investigative mechanism to collect evidence on human rights abuses. No one has been held responsible in the well-documented cases of torture and ill treatment in the crackdown by the security forces on political dissent. Hence, this confirms allegations of general impunity. The UN has recently strengthened the mandate of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to fight the impunity of the regime, including his special forces. I view this as an important step forward. But most importantly, people in Belarus need to see justice served for those responsible for violence and torture. So if I had to summarize what the international community can do, I would have them focus on solidarity, support, and consistency. The international solidarity with Belarusians in the pursuit of freedom and democracy has been overwhelming, and it should be converted into concrete actions. The Belarus Democracy, Human Rights and Sovereignty Act of 2020, introduced shortly after the crackdown began, was enacted into law within just 3 months with overwhelming bipartisan support. It created a broader framework to address the current situation, including sanctions, assistance for civil society and independent media, and efforts to reveal the scale of financial abuse by Lukashenko and his cronies. And the European Union has adopted its own country-specific targeted restrictive measures. Sanctions do send a strong signal to abusive regimes and individual perpetrators. The next round must target the so-called Lukashenko wallets, oligarchs who he installed to handle his financial cut. And such measures should also target those who have been at the core of the repression machine: judges, prosecutors, investigators, and state propaganda. But the key element of the sanctions is their conditionality. It is paramount that any suspension of sanctions must be strictly conditioned by the progress in the resolving of the ongoing crisis. This would include all of the following: the end of the violence, unconditional release of the political prisoners, restoration of the rule of law, and launch of a genuine dialogue between the legitimate representatives of Belarusians and the regime. Belarusians need support, especially the civil society and grassroots movement, human rights defenders, independent media, unions, and businesses. As the European Union has drafted a comprehensive plan to support Belarus during the transition and after free elections, the US should join this work to start developing a joint Marshall Plan for Belarus. We need to be prepared. And I'm really encouraged to see that the Biden administration is emphasizing that its foreign policy will make human rights and democracy a priority. And we believe that the United States has an exceptional standing to lead by example and possesses unique leverage to align the positions and coordinate the international community's practical steps on Belarus situation. And in the meantime, some might want to try to capitalize on the weakness of Lukashenko by advancing their own interests contrary to the will of the Belarusian people. Therefore, it's essential that the United States, European Union, the United Kingdom, Canada, and other like-minded nations call on the international community not to sign any international agreements with the Lukashenko regime, since doing so would contradict the will of the Belarusian people and undermine the sovereignty of Belarus. Similarly, it should be considered that any contracts to purchase Belarusian state-owned enterprises with an illegitimate President Lukashenko might be revised and void. Ultimately, all the measures and steps taken in the international arena should prioritize the start of the dialogue as the main objective. Such a dialogue in its turn should lead to a new free and fair elections with international observation. So Belarusians need space and appropriate conditions to rightfully choose their leaders in a competitive process and ensure that the results of the elections are credible and recognized by international community. Most importantly, Belarusians must fully own the results of peaceful transition of power to open a new chapter in the history of our country. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Svetlana, for this amazing speech, which I found really really inspiring, not least because I've been watching Belarusian democracy movements for a while. It feels like at least 15 years. And I remember vividly feeling anguished at seeing earlier versions crushed by Lukashenko. You may remember the blue jean shirt revolution back in the day, other similar attempts to get the West's attention. And I'm really profoundly impressed by how thought out and organized and specific your requests and recommendations are. That to me is already an immense change in how the democracy movement is presenting itself to its Western allies. That's a huge difference. We have another 20 minutes until you have to leave. And we do want our listeners to be able to ask some questions too. And I'll be getting those in some way by email. But I'm going to give people some time to think about questions. So I'm going to start with a couple of questions myself, if I may. And I have to say, I've been looking forward to this conversation for a very long time. I was I heard you speak at a congressional hearing last week at the House Foreign Affairs Committee. I saw that the members of the House of Representatives were very impressed by you, enjoyed discussing with you. And so I was really pleased that you had made time in your schedule for us as well. Let me talk about your Belarusian liberation plan. It has a really ambitious timeline. You would like to have talks with Lukashenko on new elections begin in May, and to have those new elections in October. That's still the timeline that you have in mind, right? What makes you think that Lukashenko, who appears to be digging in, who appears to be doubling down on repression, and who also appears to have the support of a nervous autocrat farther east in Moscow, what makes you think that he can be brought to the table?
First of all, I have to admit that we are not looking for dialogue with Lukashenko himself, because for 26 years we understood that everything that he's interested in is keeping power. So he doesn't take care about his nation, he doesn't take care about his country, he takes care only about himself. But we are sure that there are people in the government or his nearby circle that also think as the majority of people, who also want to build new country for new generation, who don't want our children to live under the same pressure or under dictatorship as they lived. And we are calling for those people who are responsible, who feel this responsibility, because the majority of people in government are also on our side. They are frightened. They even maybe more scared than usual people, because they have these high ranks and positions, but we're still sure that there will be brave people there. And so as we are calling for international help in organizing this negotiations or dialogue, we understand that it's easier to have this context not with with Lukashenko himself. I even don't want to pronounce this surname, but with people who are in system, who understand that it's easier to contact them, to organize dialogue with these people who wants to better life for themselves, for a new generation. And that's why we are trying to install these connections. And we secretly already contacting to some people. We have secret contacts in Ministry of International Affairs with Riot Police. But now at this very moment, they give us information, they give us videos of tortures and violence, just to show to the people, to remind every day that we are fighting against violence, against brutality, against fraudulent elections for our future. So we are sure that we will succeed sooner or later, but the question is what price we will have to pay for during this fight. Yeah, we don't want any more victims. We have enough already. So, and just maybe, answering the future questions, that's why we are urging other countries to act now, because every day is important for those who are in jail, who are under constant pressure in Belarus. Just every day is important. So the sooner we act in Belarus, and the sooner international society act, the sooner we will have this dialogue we are striving for in new elections. The sooner we will be ready to solve this political and humanitarian crisis in Belarus.
Right, fair enough. Let me come to a question from the chargé d'affaires, Erik Jan van Oosterhout, I hope that's pronounced correctly, of the Dutch embassy in Minsk, and I'll add a little twist of my own. He asks, how would you interpret yesterday's events? Now, March 25th, yesterday, was the informal Belarus Independence Day, the anniversary of Belarus's short-lived declaration of independence from Russia in 1918. You had called for demonstrations, and he'd like to hear your assessment of those. And let me add my own question to that. I think we've all seen the comment from the commander of the Belarusian Interior Ministry troops, who said of the demonstrators, they're absolutely the enemies of our state. And he said if people do come out, he would repeat last year's crackdown, quote unquote, with great pleasure. So how can Belarusians mobilize safely and continue to make themselves heard, given the regime's intention to crack down?
Safeness of people is our priority. Again, I have to repeat that we don't want victims, but we see the escalation of violence from the regime. We all see the preparation of riot police to this day, to the 25th of March. We have heard about the threat of terroristic attack from our, secret sources. That's why we called people not to demonstrate massively, because we understood that riot police is ready to suppress these demonstrations with guns, with all this power. We called people to act safely, to do different flash mobs in different parts of cities, not centralized. Mm-hmm. We just told them to go out for a walk without any symbolic, because it's like a red cloth for to make fireworks, to put our symbolic everywhere, just not showing people, just to show, because we understand that even these small signs of presence of Belarusian people, with these symbolic gestures, they are, regime is afraid even of these ribbons, of these small, papers. And, people heard us, but the regime is so, frightened, but by usual people, by peaceful people, that yesterday preventively, more than 200 people have been snatched, from the street. They are afraid. What regime want to do now? They want to show to the international society, to the world, that everything is settled down, everything is calm. Look, everybody is happy. No one on the streets. But people are not ready to give up. They will show their presence every day, even under threat of their safeness, under threat of jail, everything. They will fight with more safe methods of fighting, but they will continue. And regime doesn't understand that they can't suppress the wish of Belarusian people for building a new country, for changes, for new elections. And it will be, again, it can be very long fight, you know, with many victims from the side of the regime. So, but we want to be settled in the shortest period, just for the sake of Belarusian people. And people will continue to go out. People will continue to be snatched by the regime, to be kidnapped, and the houses will be searched, and people will be jailed and sentenced to years of in prison. But it will not stop people. So we want to ask international society how many victims is enough to act faster, to act stronger, you know, to understand that, you know, regime, sorry.
No, I didn't want to interrupt you, but I just want to say, I think I think many of us, me included, have been tremendously impressed by the creativity and the bravery of ordinary people in Belarus. In the way they've figured out ways of evading the forces of oppression. And honestly, for those of us who are old enough, I was a university student in 1989 when the wall came down, and then in the following years when the Warsaw Pact dissolved, and a lot of the former Soviet republics became free, and then, you know, joined the West, the EU and NATO. And I remember how afraid and how thrilled we were, how afraid for people, because people died. People in the Baltics died for their freedom. And nobody wants that to happen again in Belarus. But we want this story to have a happy ending. So let me ask you a question from Trudy Rubin, who is a worldview columnist at the Philadelphia Inquirer in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. What more, she asks, can the US do to support democracy in Belarus beyond sanctions? Do you think President Biden should should send a message to the regime that it's time to leave, to give up?
You see, the USA is the oldest democracy, I say, in the world, and it's a very powerful country. And every country in the world is listening to the USA. And I think that the help of the USA can play a crucial role in solving this humanitarian crisis in Belarus. I'm just joking. Even if Joe Biden would say, like, live long Belarus in Belarusian, Живе Беларусь, it would be such an inspiration for Belarusian people. We know that the USA with us. Everybody in Belarus heard Joe Biden's words that we are standing with Belarusian people for they fight for democracy. And people, they are so vulnerable now in Belarus, and they need this help very much. And they really wait for concrete steps from the USA and from Joe Biden. And we see the USA is very powerful strength, you know, it's very powerful
actor.
I don't know, actor, thank you. And our story, our Belarusian story, can really be successful. We are fighting inside the country, and any strong word from outside, and moreover the coalition of democratic forces like the USA, Canada, European Union, and some other countries can become the beginning of the end of the regime in Belarus. So we want Belarus to be on the agenda in the USA. And just, we want to show you that this is our pain, and we want to pass to you, you know, this is very important to us. We are so far away from you, but we don't become less important to the world because we, you know, we are far away from the USA. So, sure. Yeah, so you understand your power as the country and Joe Biden as president. And we just calling to assist us in this difficult path for democracy. Again, I want once again to underline that we will win sooner or later, but what the price? You can make this price very low. I mean, to our people.
Fair enough. I'm conscious that we only have a few more minutes, so I'm going to try and squeeze in two more questions, if I may. One from Tatiana Termacic, who is a division head at the Council of Europe, of which Russia is a member, as you know. And she's asking a really a hard question. Is there any way to engage Russia on the democratic transition in Belarus? I mean, as you and I both know, there are very old cultural, social, economic, political binds in Belarus going in both directions, to Western Europe, to Poland, Lithuania, but also to Russia. And I think, you know, there's been a recent survey by this German institute called Zeus, which also shows that Belarusians don't want to cut off these relationships with Russia. Is there any way, do you think, to engage the Russians to say this is not dangerous for Russia? Or do you think that this is actually, that the Belarusian freedom movement is sort of a template for opposition movements in Russia?
You know, I understand that I don't want to say that we are opposition movement, we are the majority movement. You know, in Russia, maybe they're afraid that it can happen when we are succeed. So it can happen in Russia as well. You know, these demonstrations against the regime. But, you know, this is, our fight is not pro-Russian or pro-European. Yes, we are fighting inside the country. Our fight is between past and the future. And we always be together with Russia. And it's not fair for them to decide whether we, you know, live with Lukashenko or we want to choose a new president, but to to make them to involve into peaceful transition of power. International society have to make Lukashenko too expensive to Russia economically and politically. So all the pressure has to be put, you know, inside on the regime, just for Russia to understand that there is no threat for Russia. They always will be our neighbors, and maybe our, not maybe, for sure, our future relationships will be better, more transparent, you know. But
well, I mean, you're asking for a choice that ideally the Russians would also have, right? The choice of how the country is governed and by whom.
Yes, absolutely. There is no threat in the future president. You know, maybe we will, you know, who knows what maybe we will have in closer relationship with Russia in future. But this is up to Belarusian people, not up to one person's side.
Exactly.
You know?
Agreed. We have time for one last question, Svetlana, if I may. And it won't have escaped you that we in America and in Europe, I'm German, have our own problems with democracy at home. And that there is a tangible mood of humility about our own ability to support democracy abroad while we have these problems at home. Do you have any advice for us based on your own experience?
It's pity to admit that people who live in democracy for so long time forget about how valuable democracy is. That there are people in other countries who are on the difficult path to build this democracy. So just value what you have. Don't spoil the meaning of democracy, because there are people who are dying, who are suffering for building this democracy. And, like when you are overwhelmed with your rights, with your, understanding that you can decide everything, you start to, how to say, you, again, I will repeat, you start to lose these values, of democracy.
Understood.
And just value what you have. Don't look for something better, because this way from dictatorship to democracy is too difficult. So try to improve what you have, and think about those who are, again, dying for the values you already have.
Thank you very much. I think those are fantastic words to end this conversation on. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. It's been an honor and personally a pleasure. Please stay safe, and I hope we will have the privilege of welcoming you at Brookings in person in the not too distant future. I'd be thrilled.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.